In a distant village tucked away beyond the rolling hills of Africa, lived a young woman named Bisi. At just 20, she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her father had passed when she was 16, leaving her and her devoted mother to fend for themselves. They toiled from dawn to dusk, barely scraping by, yet always managing to put food on their modest table. Though their life was hard, Bisi's beauty radiated like a hidden gem among the villagers. Her curvaceous figure, dark skin that shimmered under the sun, and her lively eyes had the power to capture the gaze of any man who dared to glance her way. Despite her outward beauty, Bisi was no stranger to hardship. Day after day, she worked with unwavering determination, her hands roughened by endless hours in the fields. "Mother, let me go to the farm today. You deserve to rest," she would often say, her voice full of love and respect. Her mother, always weary from life's struggles, would smile with pride, replying, "Oh, my daughter, may the gods bless you with children that will ease your burdens in life." Bisi would laugh and respond, "Amen, mummy. Just don't forget to make that egusi soup and amala I love." Her mother, eyes twinkling, would say, "Trust your mother, child, just don't overwork yourself." For 4 long years, Bisi and her mother had fought their way through the storms of life. With each passing day, the shadow of her father's absence loomed large, casting a deeper cloud of worry over their household. There were nights when Bisi would sit in her small room, staring at the moonlight slipping through the cracks of the roof, wondering if life would ever be kind to them again. Her mind raced with questions, her heart heavy with uncertainty. How long can we keep going like this? One day, as Bisi reached their small maize plantation, she froze in her tracks. What greeted her was a nightmare. The once vibrant maize plants stood ravaged, torn to shreds by pests. Her heart sank, and tears stung her eyes. She looked up to the heavens, fists clenched. "Why, God? Why do we deserve this? This was our hope for survival, and now it's gone," she cried, her voice trembling. This was the crop they had planned to sell at the market to earn money for food. But now, all that hope had been gnawed away by rodents and insects. Defeated, she trudged home to her mother, the weight of the loss heavy on her spirit. Her mother, wise with years of hardship, placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We must not lose faith, Bisi," she said quietly. "We cannot let desperation drive us to rash decisions. We will work on other people's land and earn what we can." The very next day, both women worked from morning until the sky turned dark as laborious on the chief's farmland. Sweat poured from their brows, and their bodies ached, but they persevered. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they had earned enough to keep going for a few more days. But the endless labor began to take its toll on Bisi. Her body, already worn from years of struggle, gave way. The next morning, she awoke feverish, her body weak from exhaustion. Her mother stayed by her side, nursing her through the sickness that gripped her, praying fervently that it wouldn't claim her life as illness once did her father. 4 days, Bisi teetered between life and death, but slowly, she recovered, her spirit resilient despite her brush with fate. As time passed, the men of the village began to circle Bisi like vultures drawn to her beauty and her undeniable strength. Her suitors were many men who whispered sweet promises of love, hoping to win her heart. But Bisi had been through too much to be swayed by empty words. She rejected them one by one. Many of these men were hardworking but lacked the means to give her the life she desired. "I've suffered too much in my mother's house," she would say to herself. "I cannot marry a man only to suffer again." Her mother, unaware of the reasons behind her daughter's constant rejections, sat her down one day for a heart-to-heart conversation. "My daughter," she said softly, "no condition is ever permanent. Just because someone lacks today does not mean they will lack forever. Not everything that glitters is gold, and you must look before you leap." But Bisi, driven by her desire to escape the hardships of her life, could not see the wisdom in her mother's words. How could she marry a man who was still struggling when she had struggled all her life? In her desperation to find an already established man, Bisi brushed off her mother's advice, choosing instead to wait for what she believed was the life she deserved. One fateful day, during a grand festival in the village, Bisi crossed paths with a man named Kowody. He was from a distant land, a village many miles away, and carried himself with an air of confidence that immediately caught her eye. His face was striking, handsome, with sharp features and a gentle smile that seemed to hide untold stories. He stood tall, his frame strong and assured. Kowody looked like everything Bisi had dreamed of in a man. Wealth seemed to cling to him, not in the form of extravagant clothes or flashy jewelry, but in the quiet way he spoke and the calm in his eyes. A mutual friend introduced them, and as Bisi learned more about him, her heart began to race. This is the one, she thought. Her friend whispered that in Kowody's village, finding a wife was difficult, and he had come here in search of one. Hearing this, Bisi's hopes soared. She was desperate to escape the grind of her current life, and this man, with his promising future, seemed to be her ticket out. Their conversation quickly turned serious, and Kowody, with his deep voice and kind demeanor, proposed a relationship. But Bisi, ever cautious and determined to secure her future, suggested they find a quieter place to talk. She led him to the shade of a large mango tree, where the world around them seemed to fade away. The air was thick with expectation, and under the cool leaves, Bisi's mind raced with thoughts of what her life could become with a man like Kowody by her side. Sitting together, Bisi's excitement bubbled over. Her questions came quickly, without pause, as she tried to probe into his life, his work, his wealth, his future. She needed to know whether Kowody could lift her out of the poverty that had chained her for so long. Kowody, patient and understanding, answered each question with calm honesty. "I am not a wealthy man by the world's standards," he said, "but I am rich in what matters. I own 6 acres of cocoa farmland, inherited from my father. I have built my own house. I can take care of you." His words settled like honey in Bisi's heart. Though he wasn't the towering figure of wealth she had dreamed of, he had enough to give her a life better than the one she had now. Smiling, she took his hand and whispered the words that would change her fate, "I will marry you." Their courtship was brief, and soon enough, Bisi left her mother's home to live with her new husband. At first, everything seemed perfect. Kowody's home was modest but comfortable, and though their life was not one of luxury, it was far from the hardships she had known. But the peace didn't last. During the first year of their marriage, disaster struck. A torrential rain began to fall one evening, a rain that didn't stop. For 5 relentless days, the heavens poured, and soon, the riverbanks overflowed, flooding some parts of the village and its farmlands. Kowody's precious cocoa crops, the very foundation of their livelihood, were destroyed. The floodwaters swallowed the fields whole, leaving nothing but mud and ruin in their wake. Kowody was devastated. His face, once filled with quiet confidence, now sagged with despair. He couldn't stop blaming himself. "I should have diversified, Bisi. I should have invested in other crops, in other businesses," he muttered endlessly, pacing the floor of their home. "I put all our hopes into this one thing, and now look. It's gone. Everything I built, gone." Bisi, who had once seen Kowody as her savior from poverty, now felt the weight of despair creeping back into her life. She tried to comfort him, offering kind words and soft reassurances, but deep inside, a gnawing thought had begun to take root. "Is this my fate? To struggle forever, no matter who I marry?" Kowody, though shaken, eventually resolved to start afresh. He had saved some money, enough to begin again, though on a much smaller scale. Together, he and Bisi worked on a new acres of land, trying to rebuild what they had lost. But the life Bisi had dreamed of, the life free from hardship, was now slipping further and further away. Day by day, her hands became rough again, her body worn from labor, just as it had been when she lived with her mother. The endless days of work on the farm felt like a cruel twist of fate, and the hope she had clung to began to crumble. Each night, as she lay beside Kowadi in their small home, her mind would drift to the dreams she once had, dreams of a wealthy, carefree life. Now, they felt like nothing more than illusions, distant and unreachable. She couldn't help but ask herself, why is my life like this? Why can't I escape this endless toil? Depression settled over Bisi like a dark cloud. Her once bright eyes grew dim with the weight of disappointment. The joy she had once felt, the hope that had filled her when she married Kowadi, was now a distant memory. And as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, the hard truth began to sink in. There was no escaping the hardship that seemed to follow her at every turn. One afternoon, as Bisi wandered through the bustling market, her mind preoccupied with the weight of life's struggles, she felt a pair of eyes on her. The gazes of the villagers were nothing new to her. She was accustomed to the admiration her beauty attracted, but this time, it felt different. Turning slightly, she saw him, a tall, regal figure dressed in fine garments, his posture commanding. His skin gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes, sharp and intense, locked onto hers with an unsettling confidence. It was Prince Kola. With a slow, deliberate stride, the prince approached her. His voice, smooth as silk, cut through the chatter of the marketplace. "I am Prince Kola of this village," he announced, his lips curling into a smile. "Surely, you've heard of me?" Bisi, caught off guard, glanced up, meeting his gaze. "No, Your Majesty, I am new to this village," she said softly, her heart quickening. There was something both enchanting and dangerous about him, like a flame that drew her closer even though she knew it could burn. The prince's smile widened. "Well, now you know, epitome of beauty," he said smoothly. "You must visit the palace tomorrow. I insist." His voice was laced with charm, and the compliment, though grand, stirred something in Bisi. Her cheeks flushed as she smiled back, unable to hide her excitement. "No problem, Your Majesty," she replied, her heart fluttering at the thought of being in the presence of royalty. As she continued her shopping, an elderly woman from the market gently pulled her aside, her face creased with concern. "Be careful of Prince Kola," the woman whispered urgently. "He may be charming, but he is dangerous. His heart is not kind." But Bisi, her mind already filled with fantasies of becoming the wife of a prince, brushed off the warning. A prince? Interested in me? The thought was intoxicating. "Thank you, Ma," she muttered, but her thoughts were already elsewhere, racing with possibilities. She left the market with a small, secretive smile on her lips. What if I had met the prince before I married Kowadi? That question replayed in her mind all night. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the image of the prince from her thoughts. The next morning, Bisi, her heart pounding with anticipation, concocted a small lie. She told Kowadi that she felt unwell and would not be able to accompany him to the farm. As soon as he left, she quickly dressed, her pulse quickening as she made her way to the palace. The grandeur of the building struck her, but it was the thought of meeting the prince again that made her heart race. Inside, Prince Kola greeted her with the same charm he had shown in the marketplace. They talked for hours, his words like honey, sweet and smooth, drawing her in deeper with every passing minute. "Can we be lovers?" he asked finally, his voice low and seductive. Bisi's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated before replying, "Your Majesty, I am married." The prince raised an eyebrow. "Really? For how long? Do you have children?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "No, I was married just 6 months ago," Bisi replied, her voice faltering slightly. The prince's gaze lingered on her, and after a pause, he said, "Well, if you've been married for that long, you should be with child by now." "Why aren't you?" Bisi stiffened, a slight unease creeping up her spine. It is a matter between me and my husband, she said, her tone firm. I cannot discuss that. The prince leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. I see, he murmured. Well, think about it, Bisi. The palace could be your home, and I could give you a life most women can only dream of. You are beautiful, you deserve more than the struggles of an ordinary life. That day, Bisi left the palace, her mind clouded with conflicting thoughts. As she walked away, Prince Kola's eyes followed her, his gaze fixed on her like a predator watching prey. She will be mine, he thought to himself. One way or another. When Bisi returned home, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The prince's words echoed in her ears. Could I really leave my struggling life behind and become a queen? The thought consumed her. She knew she shouldn't be entertaining such ideas, but the allure of a royal life was too strong to resist. She began to weigh the possibilities, thinking of how her life and her mother's could be forever changed. Then, one day, out of nowhere, the prince made his move. Kowadi and Bisi were just beginning their mourning when they heard a commotion outside. Stepping out of their small house, they were met with a sight that made Bisi's heart stop. Prince Kola stood at the front of their home, flanked by a dozen royal guards, his expression hard and unyielding. I am here for Bisi, the prince declared, his voice booming across the small courtyard. By the power vested in me as prince of this village, I declare her my wife to be. Kowadi, though startled, stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. Your Majesty, Bisi is already carrying my child, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension. It is against tradition for a royal to claim a woman who is with child. The prince's face twitched with surprise. For a moment, he was silent, processing the unexpected news. Could it be true? His mind raced. If Bisi was truly pregnant, he had no claim over her. But something in him didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. He had come too far, his desire for Bisi too strong to let this stop him. Well, the prince said slowly, his eyes shifting toward Bisi, I don't believe you. He turned to her, his gaze piercing. Let her speak for herself. Bisi, are you pregnant? Time seemed to slow as Bisi stood frozen in place. The weight of the decision pressed on her chest like a boulder. She glanced at Kowadi, his eyes pleading, full of trust and love. But then, the image of the prince, his promise of a life of luxury, flashed before her eyes. No, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I am not pregnant. Kowadi's face fell, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Bisi, he choked out, his voice trembling with heartbreak. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, I thought you loved me. Are you really going to leave me in this time of struggle, when I need you most? Bisi, unable to meet his gaze, whispered, I'm sorry. Without another word, the prince took Bisi by the arm and led her toward the palace. Kowadi, broken and betrayed, stood there, his heart shattering with every step she took away from him. Alone in his home, he collapsed to the floor, sobbing. But, we were together. How could she deny me my child? She has chosen wealth over love, over our life. The pain in his chest was unbearable. Oh, my God. I am finished. 4 days, Kowadi remained in that dark place of sorrow, but eventually, he rose, determined to rebuild his life without Bisi. Life in the palace had given Bisi everything she thought she ever wanted: luxury, wealth, and power. With Prince Kola at her side, she seemed to have finally achieved the dream she had so desperately chased. The prince, however, was drawn to her for nothing more than her beauty. His affection was shallow, born from lust and not love, and Bisi knew it deep down, though she tried to ignore it. Every night, the prince would have intimacy with her. However, there was no tenderness in his intimacy, no real connection in his eyes. Still, Bisi consoled herself with the wealth she now possessed. She sent money back to her mother in large sums, enough to secure their future, but she avoided visiting her mother, fearing the questions that would come if she returned home. As months passed, the royal family began preparing Prince Kola for a sacred ritual that would mark his ascension to king. It was a powerful ceremony, steeped in tradition and ancient warnings. Among the rituals, there was one particularly grave rule: the prince was forbidden from having intimacy with a woman who was pregnant. To violate this would bring a great curse, not upon the prince, but upon the woman herself. The oracle had spoken of this many times, and though the prince knew of the consequences, he paid little mind. The lust he felt for Bisi clouded his judgment. On the night of the ritual, after all the preparations were complete, the prince defied the sacred rule due to his arrogance or even wicked attitude. After all, nothing would happen to him, only the woman would suffer the consequences. He called Bisi to his chamber, ignoring the warnings of the oracle, and took her again, dismissing the ritual's curse as mere superstition. Bisi, although uneasy, was swept into the moment, not realizing that the consequences of that night would soon unravel her entire life. They had very deep intimacy that night, and both enjoyed it. Months later, Bisi began showing signs of pregnancy. She knew deep in her heart that this child belonged to Kowadi, not the prince, but any guilt she had felt for leaving her husband had long faded. The luxuries of the palace dulled her conscience, and she pushed the thought of Kowadi to the back of her mind. Now, her focus was on enjoying the life she had fought for, and being a mother in a royal palace seemed to solidify her new status. But as soon as her pregnancy became visible, the prince lost interest. He turned to other wives in the palace, leaving Bisi to endure her pregnancy alone. The prince, now preparing for his kingship, was cold and distant. When Bisi complained of strange occurrences, like the eerie sound of babies crying in the middle of the night, he brushed her off. "It is your responsibility to deal with your own pregnancy," he said dismissively. "I have other matters to attend to. Your time has passed now that you are pregnant." His words were like a knife to Bisi's heart, and the reality of the life she had chosen began to sink in. What she had once seen as an escape had now become a prison. The mysterious occurrences grew more frequent. Every night, just as she drifted off to sleep, the wails of babies echoed through her room. Cold drafts swept through the chamber, and shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision. No matter how many times she tried to speak to the prince or the palace staff, no one would listen. The loneliness gnawed at her, and the once grand palace now felt like a cold, haunted place. On the day of her labor, Bisi gave birth to a healthy baby. The delivery was smooth, and for a brief moment, she felt relief. The prince, seeing that the birth had gone well, seemed to return to her side, doting on her and the newborn. But that night, as the palace grew quiet and the candles burned low, a strange feeling washed over Bisi. She awoke in the middle of the night, her hand instinctively reaching for her child. But the baby was gone. Panicked, she looked down at her stomach, and what she saw chilled her to the bone. Her belly was swollen again, just as it had been the day before. "What madness is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can I be pregnant again?" Fear gripped her, and she locked her chamber door, terrified that the prince might see her like this. The next night, the same thing happened. Bisi felt the unmistakable pain of labor and gave birth once more, only for the baby to disappear in the night and her belly to swell again by morning. Day after day, she experienced the same horror. She was trapped in a nightmarish cycle, giving birth to the same child over and over again, only to be pregnant once more by dawn. The palace doctors were paralyzed with fear. They refused to attend to her any longer, whispering about curses and dark magic. The news of Bisi's condition spread quickly through the village, and rumors of a woman cursed to give birth every day sent waves of fear through the villagers. They spoke of her in hushed tones, calling her a bringer of bad luck. Even the royal family could not ignore the whispers any longer, and soon, It was decreed that Bisi must leave the palace, must leave the village altogether. They feared that her curse would bring disaster to them all. The prince, who had once desired her so intensely, now ordered her exile without hesitation. He knew that he was the cause of her curse, but his guilt was outweighed by his desire to distance himself from the disaster that Bisi had become. She was nothing more than a reminder of his defiance of the oracle's warning. Pregnant and alone, Bisi was forced to leave the palace with nowhere to go. Her village was days away, and the journey through the forest would be dangerous, especially in her condition. But there was no choice. She walked for hours in the forest, her body weak and her spirit shattered, when suddenly she heard the sound of hooves approaching. It was Kowadi. His eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and compassion, met hers. Without a word, he helped her onto his horse and took her back to her village. Along the way, neither spoke much, the silence heavy with unspoken pain. When they finally arrived at her mother's home, Kowadi turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "You should never have followed that path, Bisi," he said. "Not all that glitters is gold. See the curse you have brought upon yourself. I forgave you for what you did, that's why I came to help you. I loved you, but it is too late now. I have moved on, and I hope your curse will be lifted here, among those who care for you." Tears streamed down Bisi's face as she whispered, "I am sorry." Kowadi, though his heart still ached for her, mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the distance forever. Bisi was left to face the consequences of her choices, alone and burdened by a curse that might never be lifted. When Bisi finally returned home, her face pale and eyes hollow from the weight of her ordeal, she fell into her mother's arms. Sobbing uncontrollably, she recounted everything that had happened, from the prince's seduction to the strange, cursed births that had driven her from the palace. Her mother listened in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the horror of her daughter's fate. She held Bisi tightly, trying to reassure her, though her heart was filled with dread. That night, as Bisi lay restless in her bed, the familiar pains of childbirth gripped her once more. Her mother, too afraid to sleep, rushed to her side and helped her deliver yet another baby. But this time, something was different. As the sun rose and the house filled with light, the baby did not vanish like before. Instead, it lay there, its tiny chest rising and falling with soft breaths. Bisi, exhausted and trembling, looked at her swollen belly and realized, with horror, that she was still pregnant. That night, it happened again. A second baby entered the world, and now two lay on the ground before her. Her mother, though terrified, could not abandon her daughter. With every birth, her fear grew, but so did her love. For 5 days, Bisi gave birth to 5 babies, each night bringing the same pain and fear, and each morning leaving her with more children. Her mother kept the strange events a secret from the village, afraid of what people might say or do. Yet the burden became too much to bear alone. Desperate for answers, Bisi's mother called for a renowned herbalist, a man said to have knowledge of the unseen and the spirits that haunted the land. He arrived quietly one evening, his face shadowed by the dim lantern light, and listened carefully as Bisi's mother explained the bizarre curse that had befallen her daughter. The herbalist's expression darkened as he examined Bisi and the 5 babies now in her home. He muttered strange words under his breath, his hands moving in slow, deliberate gestures as if he were feeling for something unseen. Finally, he turned to Bisi's mother, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "These are not human children," he said gravely. "They are spirits, efufu spirits, cursed beings that return to her womb each night only to be born again. They are disguising themselves as babies, but they belong to the other world." Bisi's heart sank as she listened to his words. The herbalist continued, explaining that the source of the curse lay in her relationship with Prince Kola. The prince, he revealed, carried a dark ritual within him, a ritual known as efufu, which was passed down through his bloodline. Any woman who had intimacy with him would be marked by this spirit, cursed to give birth to the efufu in the form of a human child. Bisi stared at the herbalist in horror, her mind reeling. "Is there a way to stop it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The herbalist paused, his face grim. "There is one way," he said finally. "But it is a price no woman would ever want to pay. You must sacrifice your womb to the efufu spirit. Only then will the curse be broken, and the babies will vanish." Bisi's breath caught in her throat. To sacrifice her womb meant she would never bear children again. She would be barren, shunned in her village, and without any hope of building a family. But as she looked down at the 5 babies lying before her, spirits disguised in human form, she knew she had no other choice. The weight of the curse was too heavy to bear. After a long moment of silence, Bisi nodded, her heart heavy with sorrow. "I will do it," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that filled her eyes. "I will sacrifice my womb." The ritual was performed the next day. The herbalist, with his sacred herbs and chants, called upon the spirits, demanding they release their hold on Bisi's body. As the ceremony progressed, Bisi felt a strange sensation in her belly, a pulling and twisting deep inside her. She gripped her mother's hand, fighting back the pain and the tears. When the ritual ended, the 5 babies she had birthed vanished, fading into the air like wisps of smoke. The house fell eerily quiet, the heavy presence that had lingered for days finally gone. But with their disappearance, so too went Bisi's ability to ever have children again. The efufu spirit had taken her womb as its payment, leaving her barren. Bisi collapsed into her mother's arms, her body weak and trembling from the ordeal. The reality of what she had lost slowly sank in. She had traded her chance at motherhood for freedom from the curse, and now, she faced a future where she would never know the joy of raising her own child. As the news of her barrenness spread, the village began to treat her differently. Suitors who once admired her beauty and grace now looked at her with pity, or worse, scorn. Bisi knew in her heart that no man would marry her now. The path she had chosen, chasing wealth and abandoning love, had led her to this fate, one where she would forever walk alone. Her dreams of royalty, luxury, and power had dissolved like mist in the morning sun, leaving only emptiness in their wake. She had gained everything she thought she wanted, only to lose what mattered most. Now, as a barren woman, Bisi lived with the consequences of her choices, her mother the only one left by her side, a reminder of the love she had forsaken in her pursuit of a life that was never truly hers to begin with. Bisi's journey is a powerful cautionary tale about the choices we make and the consequences that follow. Her desire to escape the hardships of her life led her down a path of betrayal and heartbreak. In her desperation to find wealth and status, she ignored the advice of her mother, who warned her that not all that glitters is gold. This decision to pursue material wealth at the cost of love and loyalty left Bisi empty-handed, showing that true fulfillment cannot be found in luxury alone. Her betrayal of Kowudi, a man who loved her despite their shared struggles, marked the beginning of her downfall. Kowudi's resilience and kindness provide a stark contrast to Bisi's actions. Though devastated by her abandonment, he demonstrated the importance of compassion and forgiveness, helping her when she was most vulnerable. His wisdom in business, realizing too late the dangers of relying on a single source of income, also serves as a reminder of the importance of foresight and flexibility. Had he diversified his efforts, he might have avoided disaster. Yet despite his personal struggles, Kowudi never lost his sense of decency, showing that a good heart can remain intact even in the face of betrayal. The unconditional love of Bisi's mother stands as another pillar in this story. Even when confronted with the inexplicable horror of her daughter's curse, she stayed by Bisi's side. She protected her secret, sought help from the herbalist, and never abandoned her child. This reflects the timeless truth that a mother's love is incomparable, standing firm even when the rest of the world turns its back. Her presence offered Bisi the only solace in an otherwise cursed life, reminding us that no matter the circumstances, the love of family endures. The supernatural curse that plagued Bisi serves as a metaphor for the consequences of ignoring spiritual and moral boundaries. By becoming involved with Prince Kola, a man driven by greed and lust, Bisi set into motion a chain of events that would lead to her spiritual ruin. The prince's disregard for the sacred rituals and his pursuit of personal pleasure caused Bisi to give birth to the efufu spirits, an endless cycle of torment. This teaches us that ignoring warnings, both spiritual and moral, can have devastating effects, not just on oneself but on those we care about. Ultimately, the lesson is clear: ambition without integrity, love without loyalty, and wealth without moral grounding lead to emptiness. Bisi sacrificed her womb to stop the curse, symbolizing the ultimate price she paid for her choices. Her story reminds us that while we may chase the allure of wealth and power, it is our relationships, our integrity, and our wisdom that truly shape our destiny. Bisi's fall from grace, Kowadi's strength of character, and her mother's unwavering love all combine to show that what matters most in life is not what we have, but who we are and how we treat those around us. Please subscribe to African Folktale Spot for more amazing stories like this. See you in the next story.